Welcome back to the History Fix. Last time we talked about the nature of capitalism, and at the end of that session I traced the development of capitalism from the 15th, 16th century, when it begins, really right up to our own times, the early 21st century. Now, I also said in the course of explaining how capitalism works, I talked about how fundamental it is for capitalism to create a working class, and it has to create it in the sense that the peasants who are working on the land, who have their farms, who to a large degree are creating their own subsistence, who control their own means of production, the tools of their labour, they have to be dispossessed of their land. They have to be driven off the land. They have to be deprived of the means of creating their own livelihoods. They have to be driven into the growing towns and cities of capitalism so that they are available to work in the factories and the mines and the other workplaces of the system, so that they become wage labourers with nothing to sell except their own labour power, which they sell to the capitalist class in return for wages. So the development of capitalism involves the creation of a new social class. Now, let's take that as our starting point for a more general discussion of what we mean by class, because there's a huge amount of nonsense spoken about class. Lots of bourgeois sociology, mainstream sociology, lots of journalistic comment, lots of misunderstanding, lots of comments about class that give the impression that it's all to do with the way you talk, where you live, what newspaper you read. A lot of apparently more academic discussion of class, where it's a matter of dividing people into any number of separate categories. So there are 5 classes or there are 7 classes, and these arbitrary lines are drawn across society. All of this we need to dump if we are going to develop a scientific and therefore a historically useful understanding of what we mean by class. And I'm going to focus particularly on the nature of the working class, but many of the things that I'm going to say apply equally to other classes as well. But I'm going to use the working class, the modern working class, as my main example. And I'm going to talk about class in terms of economics, in terms of society, and in terms of politics. So there are really 3 dimensions to the way I'm going to define class. And I can preface all of that discussion with this general remark, that class is not something static, it's not something fixed, it's not a position which one finds oneself in which stays the same from the time one is born to the time one dies. Class is fluid, it's something that is changeable. It's the case that individuals can move through different class positions in the course of life, and it's certainly true that society as a whole is constantly changing the class structure. So we need to think of the thing as very much a process, not as something fixed. And we also need to think of that process as something where people are constantly being reconstituted, recreated as members of a particular class. In other words, it's something that's ongoing all of the time in all of our lives. Now, I hope that I can illustrate that as we drill down a bit and we talk about these different aspects of class: economic, social, and political. Let's start with the economic. What is fundamental to the experience of the working class in modern capitalist society is that working class people do not control property, they don't control means of production, they don't control their own workplaces. That means that they are forced to sell their ability to work to an employer who employs them in return for wages or salaries. It doesn't really matter whether it's called a wage or a salary, it's essentially the same thing. It's the reward for labour power, not labour, but labour power, the ability to work, because the work that you then do, once you've sold your labour power, is controlled by the employer, who broadly speaking decides what you do, when you do it, where you do it, and so on and so forth. Now, why is the employer employing you? Because at the heart of the system is a system of exploitation, a process of exploitation, where workers are employed in factories, in offices, in call centres, in mines, on the transport network, in all kinds of different industries. They're employed at a rate of pay which is less than the value of the work that they do, less than the value of the labour that they actually perform, because they're being employed in order to make a profit out of the work that they do. The whole system depends on that. The whole system revolves around creating profit. It's a process, remember, thinking about what I said about capitalism last time, it's a process of competitive capital accumulation, the self-expansion of capital being invested in order to get a return which is greater than the original investment in order to create profit. Well, that obviously means that what's happening when people work is they're producing value, they're producing wealth which is greater than the amount that they're being paid in wages. So they're creating a surplus for the class that controls the workplaces, the class that owns and controls the means of production. That creates class, a relationship between a class of exploiters who control the means of production and the great mass of working people who sell their labour power to them. At the heart of any serious definition of class is that idea of exploitation. Now, I know that there are gradations within social classes. I know that there are better off workers, more skilled, more highly educated, able to command a higher wage or salary. Other people who are much less well off on 0 hours contracts, casual labour, part-time employment, and so on. There are gradations within the working class, but the working class as a whole is being exploited. It's also important to say that there is a middle class of people who can be defined as the people who, in a sense, are between the capitalist class on the one hand and the mass of the working class on the other, who play the role of managing, administering the production of goods and the provision of services. And that middle group is relatively well rewarded, relatively privileged, tends to be quite conservative, therefore pro-system in outlook, not actually part of the capitalist class, but not properly part of the working class. So there are these complexities when we try and describe class in practice, but the basic underlying process that defines class is this process of exploitation. Now, that's the economic aspect. Here is a little bit more about the social aspect. If it's the case that people are coming into contact with each other economically as participants within a process of exploitation, which in turn is embedded within a wider process of competitive capital accumulation, they are also entering into social relationships with each other. Social relationships which are based on tension and conflict and a difference of interest. And everybody who works for a living occasionally has the experience of feeling that they are being bullied, or feeling they're being overloaded with work, or they're being underpaid, or they're being mistreated in some respect, and that is built into this kind of economic relationship of exploitation. A social relationship then between people who occupy different class positions within society, but those differences are characterized by tension and antagonism. So there is class conflict built into the system. At the most basic level of all, what do working people want? Working people want better treatment, better pay, better working conditions, improved holidays, a reduction in hours, an easier workload. In other words, they want a more enjoyable and better rewarded working life, but they can only achieve that by cutting into profits. So the capitalist class and the managers that they employ to police the workforce, they have an interest in knocking back those attempts by working people to improve their position. That discussion about the social aspects of class, that it is a social relationship, a basic social relationship, and a series of subordinate social relationships embedded within the general picture, that leads us to the third aspect of class, which I have defined as the political aspect of class. You see, it's perfectly possible for people in modern society, people in 19th century society, people in, let's imagine, a completely different situation altogether, a 13th century medieval society where the producing class is made up of peasants working the land, or indeed any other class society you care to think of. It's perfectly possible to imagine a situation in which people have no real understanding of their class situation, no real appreciation that society is exploitative, that society is oppressive, that they have an interest in uniting with others in the same condition, occupying the same social position, uniting with others, creating an organisation, some kind of organisation, to enable them to fight, to advance their interests or to protect their interests against exploitation. No guarantee that that will happen. There are whole periods of history, there are entire societies where the level of what I'm going to call now political organisation of working people is minimal or non-existent. Huge swathes of the world today, in the early 21st century, where there's super exploitation of workers who are completely unorganised, who have no trade union representation, and not even a sense that they are all members of a class that really has it in their interest to band together and fight against the employers and against the state that stands behind the employers. When workers begin to move towards consciousness of their position, when they begin to gain confidence in their own ability collectively to challenge the situation in which they find themselves, when they begin to create combat organisations, essentially trade unions, first and foremost, trade unions in the modern world, and they use those organisations, those collective organisations, to take action in their own interests, most obviously by taking strike action against an employer. As working people begin to do that, they become a class in a political sense, not just a class in the sense that they are exploited economically, not just a class in the sense that they have antagonistic social relations with those who employ them and manage them, but now also a class in the political sense that they are beginning to create their own organisation to represent them in a struggle against capital and the state. Once we get to that point, once working people are organised and fighting back, we begin to get the possibility, and this is when it really happens, we begin to get the possibility that working people might gain sufficiently in confidence that they begin to think beyond the limits of the trade union struggle for better wages or improved pensions or a reduction in working hours or improvement in the conditions in the workplace, or whatever the immediate trade union demand might be. They begin to think beyond that to the possibility that you could challenge the entire setup, the entire economic, social and political setup, where society is divided into classes, where society is divided into exploiters and exploited, oppressor and oppressed. In other words, the possibility of a radical social transformation emerges out of the development of class as a political force operating in the social arena. So when we think about class, it's fundamental to any analysis of any society anywhere in the world in the last 5,000 years, but above all the society that we all live in today, this deeply, deeply crisis-riven society with so much at stake, and clarity about the fact that the vast majority of us today, maybe 90% of humanity today, belong to the working class, belong to a class of people who are exploited, belong to a class of people who are in conflict with the powers that be at the top of society, belong to a class which has an interest in organising itself into a political force, not just to defend its interests within the existing system, but potentially to push way beyond and overthrow the system and create a new kind of society altogether that works in the interests of everybody. We are facing the greatest crisis in the history of humanity. Capitalism is driving us towards climate catastrophe. To understand how we got here and how we get out of it, we really need to understand human history. What we're trying to do here at the History Fix is to give us the understanding of the past that we need to equip us to fight for a better future. If you like what we're doing, please share and subscribe, and also contribute to our Patreon page. Thanks very much.